than the Romans ever done for us.
Hi, and thanks for downloading the second part of the STI in Antiquity, including contraception, podcast. You're listening to part 2. We overran a bit, we had a lot to talk about, so we decided to split it in 2 sections rather than an unmanageable and quite loathsome one massive podcast. So say hello, Emma.
Hello, Emma.
Exactly. We're both here and we're going to talk in this second podcast about the continuation of diseases, STIs, STDs, and also about the contraception that was available in ancient times. So if you haven't already, listen to part 1. If you have listened to part 1, well done, thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy part 2 as much as we did making it. Anyway, we'll go now. So listen up. Hi and welcome back. We've looked at 2 of the major contenders for STIs or STDs in Antiquity, and now we're sort of turning our attention to a few of the lesser proven ones, and also having a little debate or a little discussion about syphilis, which often gets raised or gets crowbarred into discussions on STIs, STDs in Antiquity. I just want to start with urethritis because I mentioned it earlier, and it seems that it's one of those. I'll call it, is it disease or infection?
Well, I'm going to explain that in a second.
Yeah, okay. It's one of those. And the issue with it, of course, is that it mimics or seems to mimic a number of different diseases or infections, or can do. There was a general problem that Hippocrates refers to, and he sort of mentions about how chaps are having problems when they're weeing. You see it elsewhere. There's an early reference to it, and the Eber Papyrus, again it's mid-16th century BC, and the solution was for an intraurethral application of sandalwood oil, which just sounds lovely.
Intraurethral means it's going down your penis.
Yeah.
So that's probably not very pleasant.
No, I don't think that would be.
So urethritis is more of a condition than anything else.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It is the inflammation of the urethra.
Which, yeah.
Generally these days it's associated with either sexually transmitted infections or catheterization. Obviously, if you're putting anything down the urethra, the chances are it's going to be sensitive. Well, it is sensitive. It's going to affect it in some sense. So the majority of urethritis these days are either to do with catheterization, which, as you've said just there, we'll come on to this, I think, in a later episode when we talk about medical things that were invented. Yeah, we want to do, as I mentioned earlier, we do want to do, because we did a bunch load of research, and sometimes when you're doing a podcast, something it's a very steep learning curve. I hope you appreciate that. And something that's become abundantly obvious to me is my timings are just so out the window. we sat down and we thought, okay, this is my plan, or these were my ideas for just one section, and this podcast was just going to be one section of a larger podcast. And then we looked at it, and Emma, in her best teacher voice, brought me up quite quickly and said, "This is just there's a lot here." And you knew that I was going to talk loads about it.
Yeah, and I thought it was a really good idea because in reality, I was going to say I don't have to do as much talking.
That's true. I get to do a lot of talking,
which is just better for everyone.
And
better for me.
My favourite thing as well.
Better for you. Better for the listener.
As my students will tell you, if I can talk about diseases, I will talk about
particularly
diseases.
Sexual diseases, it would seem.
Absolutely.
STIs, STDs.
Absolutely. That or rabies, but we're going to come on to that.
We do have rabies. In fact, is a terrifying instance of rabies when we look at Roman baths. And I remember finding it and then running hands aloft.
Spoil ourselves. You didn't come running hands aloft to me asking me whether it was true. But we'll save that for another time. So as I was saying, urethritis tends to be caused by urinary tract infections, which can be caused by sexually transmitted infections, but they can also occur naturally, normally. Catheterization definitely could cause urethritis. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. No question about that. Although I think any long-term urethritis would probably be more down to STIs, because if something's gone down your urethra, whether you're male or female, and then has to come out again, that is going to irritate it, and that in itself would cause urethritis. That would be not very nice. It would be uncomfortable. It would hurt for you to wee. If the inside of your penis or your urethra as a woman is damaged, it is going to hurt to urinate. I think in men, if they haven't been catheterised, the chances are it would be a sexually transmitted infection. UTIs in women and men aren't equivocal, really. Men don't tend to get UTIs as much as women, and it's all to do with the way the bacteria likes to hitch onto the urethra and then kind of work its way up. And urethra are much longer in men than women, and urination or any kind of flow of anything will knock the bacteria off quite often. So they need to hook in, they need to embed in, and they need to stay in there. In addition to that, women's urethras can be damaged in just normal sex, and that can cause UTIs, which can then cause urethritis as well. Men don't tend to get UTIs down to normal sex, whereas women do. Again, it's down to the length of the urethra, and sex can cause movement of bacteria up both urethras, but more likely up women's urethras than men's, because obviously stuff is coming out of men during sex, usually.
Particularly if you've got gonorrhea.
Yes, more so if you've got the gonorrhea. The other thing is that the most common causes of UTIs is a bacteria called Escherichia coli, E. coli, which lives quite nicely in the anal region. It can breed quite nicely in the area between the anus and the genitals, generally. But again, during sex, with women can have the E. coli transported from one area to another. Whether they're having anal sex or not, it can still happen. And sometimes if women, and excuse me if this is a bit TMI for anyone, but if women wipe the wrong way after they've been to the toilet, they can get E. coli transferred from their back to their front, which can then cause a UTI as well, which can then go on to cause urethritis. All of that said, we've already seen that gonorrhea can cause urethritis, and also there is a bacteria which causes UTIs in women that is sexually linked. And this is where I have fun saying this, because this is a great one. It's Staphylococcus saprophyticus. I think I said that right. Staphylococcus saprophyticus. That's better. Which causes infections that cause urethritis in sexually active young women especially. The main complication of urethritis in terms of a UTI way, or it can be, depending on the STI as well, is spread to the kidneys, an infection of the kidneys.
Again, I looked at some of Hippocrates' cases. I looked at some interesting reading. If you ever get the chance, I think it's Epidemics, read them. There's some quite interesting ones. And he's looking at the urine and checking out. And he mentions sometimes about black urine, kidney infections and things like that, or pain in the kidney. So
black urine would be likely a very bad kidney infection, because you'd think that would be old blood. So
we're looking here that there's plenty of source material where it's indicated that there is problems, men have problems urinating and the like. There's also a fair bit of sources, particularly I said in Hippocrates. I imagine if you were to go through Celsus, you'd see a fair bit there about similar symptoms. I think we can say that urethritis is something that would have been an occurrence. If you've got a collection of humans, you've probably got urethritis at some point.
But I do think that any of the mentions of it in men, it's likely that was sexually transmitted, or to do with a sexually transmitted infection. Whereas I think with women, as I've already said, I'm not going to rehash it, but the chances are with women it's less likely to have been that. It can be other things that cause that.
Right then, well that's that one. I wanted to throw in, I just wanted to check this one. I wanted chlamydia. And purely because...
Second favourite, this one.
There isn't... I've got to start by saying I couldn't find a definitive reference to chlamydia, which is not surprising. However, one of the side effects of it, as I understand it, one of the consequences of it, is sterility.
Yes.
And there's plenty of mention of that in Antiquity. Now, that could be caused by a number of things, I imagine. However, chlamydia would possibly be one of them. So with chlamydia, what can you give us a brief overview of it, what chlamydia is and how it functions?
Chlamydia is a bacterial infection, again, similar to syphilis in some ways. It was confused with syphilis at points, and I will talk about why that is in a moment. The bacteria that causes chlamydia is called Chlamydia trachomatis, which is quite a nice name. And there are different types of chlamydia. They're broken down into things called serotypes. I'm not going to go into what serotypes are, but serotypes D to K are the ones that cause sexually transmitted infections in the genitals. We've also got types A, B and C, which cause eye infections. And then there are types L1, L2 and L3, which cause something called lymphogranular venereum, which sounds sexually transmitted. I'm not going to go into that either, but that's the thing that looks like syphilis. That's the condition. So it is caused by a chlamydial bacteria, but it's not chlamydia as we know it. Again, as with the other bacterial infections we've looked at that are sexually transmitted, the bacteria enter through minute abrasions in mucosal surfaces. It's sexually transmitted, and again, it can be transmitted vertically from mother to child. That can cause conjunctivitis in a baby, and also something called interstitial pneumonitis, which is very rare, so we're not going to go too much into that. Complications in men are urethritis, which we talked about, epididymitis, and conjunctivitis. So chlamydia can go in the eye. We won't talk about how that happens.
Weirdly enough, but eye diseases, when we were going to do this bit on surgery, eye diseases were really big in Antiquity. I didn't realise just how much of a thing eye disease was.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that when we do that one, but the things they did with eyes,
we won't go
amazing.
There. Not now.
There is a systemic spread that can cause something called Reuter's syndrome in men. I don't know a lot about that though, so that's something I'd have to come back on. But the complications in women are worse. As Jeremy and Peep Show, for any of Peep Show fans out there, said about chlamydia, it's basically symptomless. It is, and it's not too bad for men on the whole. Whereas with women can get urethritis, they can get cervicitis, which is the swelling of the cervix, which I can't imagine is very pleasant. Lots of other itis, including the conjunctivitis, but it can cause quite nasty complications, and these aren't infrequent either. It's not rare. Ectopic pregnancies, infertility. It can damage the liver and cause pelvic inflammatory disease, which we talked about before as well. So it is quite a damaging disease, chlamydia. It's not very nice at all.
By no standards, well, none of these are really fun, but even less so chlamydia.
I think the thing about chlamydia that is so... I always talk about diseases being clever, and I don't mean it to, is the fact that it doesn't have many symptoms that are immediately obvious. The infection is likely to remain, and the longer it remains, the more likely it is to have complications, and so it is more likely. I think if we're looking at infertility in women, chlamydia was, and still can be if it's not been treated, a bigger issue than gonorrhea, just because of the symptomless stuff. If you've got gonorrhea, you will, whether you're a male or a woman,
you'll probably know.
You will know. With chlamydia, you're less likely to know, and it is a silent disease.
Well, thanks for chlamydia. Next up, very briefly, genital warts.
Genital warts are really, really interesting. They're caused by something called the human papillomavirus, HPV, which a lot of you have heard of, and there are about 120 types of HPV. And the majority of them don't really do very much, but types 16 and 18 are associated with cervical cancer, and anyone who's got any young children out there will know, well, I say young, sort of school-age children will know that there's a vaccine for HPV, for those strains of HPV now. But not all HPV strains cause genital warts. The main strains that cause genital warts are strains 6 and 11. And apparently they are low risk for cancer as well, which is quite good to know. And they're also associated with mouth and throat cancer. So this is a sexually transmitted infection that can go on to become a disease because it can cause cancer several places. And also it isn't symptomless, but in your mouth and your throat, it can just sit there for a long time without causing symptoms.
But in terms of the genital region, I obviously did reading the sources, had a look around. I couldn't find many specific references to them. I think there was a mention in, I think it was Hippocrates, saying about fungal growths around the genitals. The Roman, there's some disagreement in some of the sources where it's referenced as figs, nicknamed figs. Well,
the interesting thing you say about fungal growths is that the warts don't look like the sorts of warts you might see on your skin.
Right.
They look like, and they are termed medically, if you look on the NHS website, for example, they talk about a cauliflower-like appearance on the genitals or the anal region, and so that does look a bit mushroomy.
Perhaps, yeah, that's
a bit fig-like.
I've seen it referenced, and there wasn't. I've seen it referenced in one instance. I think it was one of the epigrams by Marshall, and he references the figs, but it's unsure whether they're piles. In some translations, I've seen it referenced that means piles. In others, genital warts, and perhaps there was a general. Again, we don't have. If you don't have a specific term for something, it might be that it was just a general catch-all term for anything that was in that area of the body.
Well, genital warts are quite common in the anal region as well.
Well, now, up next is the final one we're going to look at, I spoke about it earlier, I mentioned it earlier. Really, it's syphilis. When I went and started doing my reading, I saw it. There's lots of debate as to whether or not syphilis existed in antiquity or whether or not it was something that only existed after Columbus came back from the New World. I'm going to avoid that argument. Probably the best or the most agreeable conclusion that I read stated that there were lots of possibly similar diseases in antiquity to syphilis, or would have presented themselves in a slightly similar manner, or a type of disease that was brought over by Columbus or brought over from the New World was allowed to in some way develop in a new ecological niche. The argument I read was that there was a sort of downgraded version of syphilis, if you can imagine that, and when it hit Europe, when it was brought to Europe, it was able to go right the way through Europe simply because there was no resistance to it. And also, it had a different ecological niche because of the ecological niche it had, because you had population density, you had particular opportunities, and I keep saying ecological drivers develop in a particular way that it hadn't had the opportunity to elsewhere. You've got some people who say, we found a skeleton, and this has definitely got marks on the bones which would indicate syphilis, and this predates Columbus. You've got other people that say, well, actually, that doesn't. Point is, we don't have that smoking gun. The
interesting thing is about that is that I was saying that the lymphogranular venereum, which the chlamydia bacteria causes, is something that has consistently been confused with syphilis. So there's also that possibility as well. If I can just talk a little bit about syphilis before we stop. It's a bacteria, again. Most of them are bacteria. As I've said, we've talked about the viral ones, but the more interesting ones are the bacterial ones, in my opinion. It's called Treponema pallidum, which is quite a nice little name. And again, enters the body through minute abrasions in skin or mucosal membranes. Requires close personal contact, usually sexual. Now, the vertical spread is interesting because generally the vertical spread we've talked about before from mother to baby is down to the movement of the baby down the birth canal. But the syphilis bacteria can actually go across the placenta, which is, I find that fascinating. It's very devious, and that can affect the fetus, which can cause all kinds of horrible things. There are 3 stages, and saying about how it's similar to other things. The first stage is the genital lesion post-infection on the site of the infection. So but the difference is, it's a round, firm, and painless lesion.
Right.
So it's not like an ulcer. But if you think about it, if you've got a lesion on your penis and for some reason, or on your vagina, vulva, sorry, and for some reason it gets knocked off, that may look like an ulcer, so it could look like something else.
And if it wasn't causing you pain in antiquity, would you register it?
Exactly, it might just look like something weird going on here. Then the secondary stage is skin rashes, swollen lymph nodes, and fever. Again, that can be anything.
Yeah.
And that's probably something that happens. I mean, it happens a lot to little children, but anyone with a lower immune system, those kinds of things happen all the time, so that wouldn't necessarily notice itself. Then there's a latent phase, and the latent phase is quite clever because generally it's viruses that have a latent phase like this. Generally viruses can have a latent phase that can last decades, but syphilis can last its latent phase from 3 to 30 years.
Wow. Which
is a really, really long time. Now during that time, what it's doing is it's kind of bedding into, it's not causing symptoms, but it is bedding in, and the tertiary stage is severe medical problems, so heart, brain and other organs get damage to blood vessels, spreads to the eye or the nervous system, and something called neurosyphilis, which I think is the thing that people always think that Henry VIII had, but he didn't. Wasn't that the case?
Yeah, I was going to say Henry VIII is one of these chaps distinctly outside of my field of knowledge. From what I do know, that he is the person who's linked with having some sort of syphilis.
But there is this link with syphilis, and excuse the terribly ableist term of madness, but neurosyphilis is just where your neurological system, so your brain and your nerves, are effectively damaged very badly by the syphilis bacteria. So that is something. All the others, they can sit around and they can make you infertile, and that's not very nice. But you can carry on with a normal life.
And you think about it, if you're someone who becomes sexually active in antiquity, and say you're 16, for example, you're a chap who's 16 and becomes sexually active, and in your first year of being sexually active, you contracted syphilis. Now let's just pretend that it was in existence in antiquity, and you missed the first few phases. the latent, you might be dead. There's a strong chance you wouldn't be alive to see the latent phase. And if you do, who's going to put it in?
The tertiary phase.
The tertiary phase. Who's going to say, oh yeah, by the way, 30 years ago, I had... No one's going to put two.
Yeah, there's no link there at all. But I find it quite interesting that out of all of them, that is the one that manages... If you'd asked me at the beginning which sexually transmitted infection is going to have this interesting latent phase and then cause neurological damage, I would assume it'd be a virus, because that seems more how a virus would act. But it's not. Syphilis. So it's a cheeky bacteria there.
Cheeky indeed. Do you know why syphilis is called syphilis?
I do not. Tell me.
Well, just as well I know. Apparently in around 1530, Girolamo Fracastoro wrote a poem, and it featured a shepherd called Syphilis.
That's a good name.
Now, when a drought affected his land, he was very rude to the sun god, who then sent a plague. And that is where apparently the term syphilis, obviously in the 16th century, if you didn't know this, it wasn't really, it was called, if you were English, I think it was a Spanish disease. If you're Spanish or Italian, you called it a French disease. It wasn't, syphilis is a very much a more modern term, or more modern use of definition of the disease itself. Because I looked at this, and I'm not going to claim credit on this one. I did read it somewhere else, but couldn't find exactly where the citation was. There's a myth of Niobe, who in Greek myth insulted Apollo and Artemis because she had so many kids, and she basically just boasted a lot about how that she should be worshipped rather than these two. Never a good idea to do.
No.
Never a good idea. And they both hunted down the kids and killed them with their arrows.
Wow.
And presumably some sort of plague or illness. Anyway, when Niobe ran away, she scarpered and ended up on Mount... Spell Sipylus, so Sipylus, Mount Sipylus, where she was turned to stone. And it's possible, you've got two themes there of blasphemy and punishment. And you can argue that blasphemy and punishment happens a lot in ancient Greek myth, but you also do have the corresponding words. And I do wonder, and it was suggested, not by me, I would suggest if it was originally my idea, but it wasn't, whether or not this 1530 poem had the character of syphilis, and it was a version of that mountain. Syphilis, it kind of linked in there. So no, that's syphilis for you. I'm going to ask you a question. And so if you're listening to this, and so far I've said all of the horrible things that could come out your genitals.
Or go into your genitals.
I just want you to think, what's the worst thing that can come out of your genitals? Because up next, we're going to look at contraception antiquity, and I'm going to start with a myth. So just have a think, what's the worst kind of thing that you could have coming out of your genitals? And it's a man in this instance, it's a king. When we come back, I'm going to tell you what the worst thing to come out of your genitals was in Greek myth. Thanks for coming back. I imagine there's fewer and fewer each time I go into a bit of a brief musical break. I come back and the numbers are lower. We're down to the one or two now, so thanks for sticking with us. I did ask you before what you considered the worst thing that could come out of male genitalia were in ancient Greek myth. And it gives you a wide range of possible horrible things to come out. You might remember or know of King Minos, him of the Minotaur fame. No? Yes? Do you...
Oh, you talking to me?
Yeah, I was going to see if you...
I thought you were talking to our lovely listeners. Yes, I have.
Yeah, so you got King Minos. He had the Minotaur. His wife fell in love with a bull. And it's easily done. Now, he had a big problem, or rather his wife Pasiphae had a huge problem, because apparently King Minos had scorpions and serpents and the like in his semen. Which
I'm shaking my head at that, because I just can't. Just the thought of. I mean, he must have had a massive urethra for those
Greek
to come
myth.
out of there.
Look, he had a labyrinth. He could have. It's Greek myth, okay? He could have it.
Okay,
don't deny him
fine.
this pleasure.
It's just a strange thing.
Needless to say, this was giving the ladies that he was courting, as well as his good lady wife, quite a lot of problem, and she was not best pleased.
No.
So she decided that, look, you're not coming anywhere near me with that until we get it sorted. And enter Procris, not literally, her friend.
Okay.
She invented or came up with the idea of the condom. She suggested using the bladder of a goat, and lo and behold, Pasiphae used that. She put it in herself. And this is what I don't quite understand, though, is if the other stuff is entirely believable. They used it a couple times, and then he was okay, and then he could have kids with her. So it was obviously a kind of...
Maybe the goat bladder caught all the scorpions.
Yeah, all those
dragons.
damn... But in any case, it serves to point that contraception was in existence in antiquity, perhaps not in the way that we consider it. I think it had very different objectives. I should add at this point that this was from Greek myth, a Greek myth that had come to us that dates to about sort of 2nd century AD. So this might be retrospective. This isn't an old Greek myth that I'm aware of. I think this is written down or verbalised, as it were, in the 2nd century AD, so it might just have been reflecting practices of the time, so we'll talk about them briefly. But in any case, what it does do, it very much places contraception in the context of control of the woman. The woman was the one, it's a woman who comes up with the idea of it, and you know what, it's the woman's, she's got to sort that out.
Yeah, when I read the stuff that you gave me on contraception, I did think that it was an interesting one, that it was very much placed on the woman, everything was kind of the woman's fault. But I suppose the way they would have seen, although they knew that sperm made babies, didn't they? So let's say that the man did have some kind of input. But what I found interesting was that one of the texts you gave me, which I'm sure you'll link to, called Doctors and Diseases, was it? Talked about how abortion as birth control, or infanticide as birth control, was actually easier than what we understand as birth control now, which I found interesting in that way, that I was a bit horrified. We're not going to go into the ethics of abortion or anything, but the fact of having a baby and then killing it.
I'm not in complete agreement with that. I think there are a number of options open to a man, because that's simply the way it was. Anyone who's familiar with the societies of ancient Greece will understand that as a bloke, you had a wide avenue. You had a sort of veritable buffet of options to use sexually. And
someone called Soranus?
Oh, Soranus, yeah.
Soranus? Sir Anus. Yeah. That sounds more like the stuff we were talking about earlier.
Possibly.
Said it's safer to prevent conception from taking place than to destroy the fetus. So perhaps I did misunderstand it.
The idea was in ancient Greek society, again, this is a huge generalisation, so take it with all the salt that you can. Generally speaking, your wife was there for, I suppose you could say, rightful heirs or citizen children, and anything else went with other people. That could be men, that could be women, and I think contraception was very much an option of stopping. Sort of limiting birth control in a particular way, and by that I mean demographically. Because say, for example, I'm a middle, if you'd call it middle class Athenian. I've got 2 sons. Now it's very difficult to know whether or not you want to throw your lot in to get a third. You can have a third son, may not be a son, might be a daughter.
Imagine
horror,
a woman.
You might end up. Your wife might not be particularly keen on it because she's rolled the die twice and survived.
Yeah.
So she might not. You might not be, because lo and behold, you might actually really love your wife and think, I don't really want someone to go through with this. And this is I'd say an issue, but it was a decision to be made. Because upon your inheritance, upon you leaving, you've got a halving to thirding what you've got. And I do remember many years ago reading about that, and I don't think that was a particularly dynamic driver in terms of decisions, but I do think it was in the background humming away somewhere.
That's understandable.
So there were other options that you could pursue which didn't involve you either being with your wife, it didn't involve you having sex in a way where a child might be conceived. All of these things happen. But I think that's more a discussion for another time, because I wanted to just briefly look at the sorts of contraceptive methods that were put in place, say between a man and a woman who do want kids, who might have a relationship where children could be an outcome, and where they would employ a particular technique to avoid that being an outcome.
Can I just add a disclaimer here, because I want to say that none of these are things you should be doing.
Oh God, no. But let's look at the things that might have happened back in the day, or certainly were. We've got some papyrus, again the Ebers papyrus, and this gives the idea of honey, acacia leaves and lint to be placed in the vagina.
Well, that's quite interesting, because honey has a way apparently of if you get the right consistency of it, it can block the cervix, trap sperm,
But
then stop them going through. There's a thing called a honey cap, which some people use. Now, I don't know. I can see potentially how that might work in a theoretical sense, but again, in reality, I don't think it would.
Well, I think I should refer. I did one of my earlier podcasts where I speak at 90 miles an hour. I still apologise for that. I did it on honey and bees in Antiquity, and honey was very much used as a miracle cure for pretty much everything. It was used a lot on the body for wounds. It had a lot of medicinal purposes. I don't know if there's any kind of spermicidal properties that honey might have.
No, not as far as I could find. And also, putting honey up yourself as a woman, you're very much likely to give yourself thrush, because it will completely imbalance all your healthy bacteria down there. But yeah, I did read some things about a honey cap. A lot of the methods we were looking at looked like a cap for the cervix, talking about clogging up or plugging up the cervix. I mean, that's how a diaphragm works, I suppose. But yeah. So
I suppose what they're trying to do is there's a basic mechanic being employed.
Yeah, they've got an idea. I mean, they had speculums back in the day. I think they invented the speculum, which is a way of opening. So you can see the cervix. They obviously had an idea that sperm went into the cervix and then this did whatever it did. So they were looking at ways of either slowing the seed down or stopping the seed from getting in there. And I'd like to point out about a couple that I read that I found quite remarkable in terms of not letting the seed get in there.
Okay.
A woman must hold her breath and draw herself away a little just before the man is about to discharge his seed, so it is not hurled too deep into the uterus.
Okay.
I don't know why she needs to hold her breath.
There's
Also,
that,
that's kind of coitus interruptus to an extent.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting from that, is don't let the man ejaculate inside the woman. And then the other one that I really liked, in a kind of, I read this and I couldn't stop laughing for about 5 minutes afterwards, was after sex, squat, induce sneezing, wipe the vagina all around and drink something cold. I just imagine this, the romance is dead if you're doing that, really, isn't it?
Do you think this was invented and put about by men purely to stop after coital chat?
Possibly.
It was kind of like, I've got to get out of here. How can I get away? I know. I'll get her to sort of go and dance around and sneeze for a bit.
I mean, one of them was interesting in terms of avoid intercourse at periods that were suitable for conception. So they had some kind of idea that there were points in the month where women are more or less likely to get pregnant. I mean, I was quite fascinated with how well, up in part, they understood how women work, but then in other parts they thought the uterus sort of ran around the body, making us a bit crazy.
And you're saying it doesn't?
Nope, it stays where it is. It's our hormones that run about our body, making us crazy, but it's not just women that hormones make crazy, it's men as well. So, my favourite though, sorry to overtake this, was apparently a hairy spider amulet would stop you getting pregnant. And I want a hairy spider amulet for Christmas.
This was Pliny's, wasn't it? I think this is Pliny the Elder who decided that amulet, and we really haven't mentioned amulets much, but there was healing was in many instances couched within the worship of particular gods. So there was, I say, a magical quality. Amulets were quite popular for diseases, and when I've read again some source material, you look and you see that particular amulets, particular rites or rituals might help a condition. I didn't know about the hairy spider. But
if anyone out there has a hairy spider amulet and would like to send it to me, please get in contact, and I shall accept it gladly as a Christmas present.
Yeah, but you're going to get some really odd stuff with that request. Was there something with involved lead? White lead?
There was. I mean, I had a look and
it's horrible.
They had white lead and alum. So yeah, alum was used with white lead apparently, and so I looked it up, and alum is something that I think isn't spermicidal. It would be more used as a cervical plug. It has like a drying effect apparently. It reduces irritation. It can be used to stop bleeding as well. So I wonder whether it was something that was just kind of bunged up there. Although the book that you gave me did, bunged up there, very graphic.
Yeah, exactly. That's the official term.
I did read something that alum can have spermicidal properties, but that's not necessarily something that they'd mention on the internet.
No.
And white lead is a complex salt. So I was thinking that potentially a salt could be spermicidal as well in terms of drawing out water, potentially. But I just think putting lead on your cervix is a bad idea.
I'm not a doctor, and I have no medical training. even I realised that lead plus cervix equals bad.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I saw was that acidic juices are spermicidal. That does seem to be something. I saw a couple of medical papers about that, and they weren't saying use lemon juice to kill sperm, but they were saying that lemon juice can kill sperm in a laboratory setting. We should double check on this. We are not advocating on any of these. No.
We're just reporting what occurred. And everyone now knows where they can go if they want to look up and understand contraception a bit better.
And I just want to say as well that with all of these methods we looked at, sexually transmitted infections,
that was
would not have been prevented by anything that we've mentioned at all.
Very much. They were very much driven by the pregnancy as an outcome. That was the contraception, because I had a look, and one of the, I won't call it an urban myth, but one of the contraceptives that are referred to are sort of condoms, or pseudo condoms, as you might understand them to be. I read about Romans using animal intestines and all sorts.
That's a definite common myth, because I've heard about that.
Yeah, I couldn't really find anything to substantiate that. It might be that it was undertaken perhaps on a small number of people. Perhaps they tried it. If you can find reference to it, tweet me. I'll be interested to see. But I don't think it has been identified as a viable contraceptive option, simply because, firstly, and again, huge generalisation, men are just lazy, and if they've been told full stop, don't worry about it because it's the woman's problem and they can use white lead and sneeze.
Well, it's not even being told, is it? It's growing up in a society where getting pregnant, if it happens, is just, it's tough for the woman. And
if you're a man out in town, you're a Roman out in town, you got your hairy spider amulet, you're good to go.
I think the hairy spider amulet was something that the woman had.
Well, perhaps he just gave it to her. So there we go.
Again, romance.
There we go. Yeah, definitely. We should have done this in February. We should have done this as a Valentine's Day one. Anyway. Right, so there we are. I think we've covered pretty much everything in terms of what we were going to cover. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I want to say thanks very much for Emma. I know you were going to talk about, because I've spoken about some of the sources that I've used, and one of the books that you referred to that I lent you to look at was Doctors and Diseases in the Roman Empire by Ralph Jackson. It's a very good book.
It's really interesting.
There's a lot of content in there. So if you want to read that, or you're interested in learning a bit more, it goes into a lot more about Roman surgery. It goes into a number of different topics, but there is a whole section, I think, on sort of gynecological things.
Yeah, contraception and stuff like that. And I used mostly my trusty MIMS Medical Microbiology book, 5th edition. Anyone who's done any kind of microbiology or human biology or anything to do with diseases at all at university level will have heard of that, but it's very good. And also, if you are interested in looking up more about STIs, I would recommend the CDC website or the WHO website, or the NHS website. They're all quite interesting.
Right. So anyway, thanks again for listening. I just want to say thanks to Emma.
Thank you.
I will imagine we've still got to cover some aspects of Roman surgery, which we're going to look at, and how unhygienic Roman baths were.
Oh, it's so interesting as well. I'm really looking forward to
and
that.
And I imagine what we'll do at some point in the new year, we'll sit down and work out when we can do those and look at those. I don't think we'll have anything out, or rather, I don't think I'll be producing anything in terms of content on my podcast until the new year, simply because I've seen the way December looks and it's busy. And believe it or not, this does take quite a time to do. If you are listening to this and you're listening to it on iTunes, it would be really, really nice if you just gave me 5 stars, even if you hated this, because Santa is watching. And it's nice to get some positive feedback, because you spend a lot of time researching and you're putting this all together. Quite rightly, I don't earn anything for it.
There's no Patreon shout out just
No,
yet.
There's nothing like that. And I like to keep, it would be really good to get some nice positive feedback, constructive feedback as well, if you do think there are areas I can improve. And if there are topics you would like to hear about, then please do. Just tweet me, like I said. Ancientblogger.com is my website. Twitter @ancientblogger. Come and say hi. And if I do not interact with you, which I don't think I will do before 2018, I hope you keep well, keep safe, have a great Christmas festival, whatever it is, and
great holiday time.
Yeah, have a great holiday time. Enjoy yourself. Stay safe.
And before we go, I just want to point out, if you listen to my speaking on the horror Halloween podcasts, I mentioned a Instagram, which I no longer have. So don't try and, if you think you've typed something wrong, or one of you who might have bothered having a look, don't look anymore, because it's not there, because I've disappeared from social media. So I can focus on telling people about STIs.
On the run. Anyway, thanks again for listening. Take care, and we'll see you again soon, or you'll hear from us again soon. Bye.
Bye.
Infamy! Infamy! They've all got it in for me!